what needs to be assessed has grown exponentially. And over the years, people say, add this to the exam, add this to the exam, add this to the exam. Well, trying to remove things from the exam has been a real challenge for us. So we step back because there's a limited real estate, quite honestly, that we can have in the exam. So how do we make this more manageable for the candidates? So that's what led to CPA evolution as we know it. Over the years since I've come on board with the AICPA in 2014, we've done a lot of work. We've done 3 different practice analyses, and you say, what's a practice analysis? And that's the work where we undertake to understand what newly licensed CPAs are doing every day when they show up to work. And we need to know that because that's kind of the sweet spot of what we need to assess on the exam. And when you look at this slide, you'll see that, digital and data-driven mindset, technical accounting, IT cybersecurity, critical thinking, understanding of business processes and controls. This is kind of, really essential for CPAs to know at this point in time. And it says technical accounting, but I would kind of expand that to technical accounting, auditing, and tax work. So that's kind of, the real foundational stuff, if you will. One of the things we did a lot of work on when I first came on board between 2014 and 2016 was this concept of critical thinking and problem solving. We were hearing from the firms at the time that they were hiring a lot of really smart people, but they couldn't solve the problems. So how do we deal with that? And so we've talked a lot to academics about that, what they're doing in their programs and how we assess material on the exam, which has led to an increase in the task-based simulations, the small case studies we have on the exams with exhibits and the like. Understanding of business processes and controls. This is critical. I go back to, my early career in the late 70s and the early 80s, and we had a huge focus at the time on understanding systems and the controls related to that, identifying risk and what controls do you need to have to deal with those risks. We're hearing that that's as big an issue today as it ever was, and it continues to be a bit of a gap in what students and candidates know when they start their employment with firms. So that's an area that we focused a lot on. And I think that when you look at it, ties in pretty tightly to this concept of a digital and data-driven mindset, because again, so much data exists in the world today, and it's all coming out of the business processes, the IT systems. And if that's not properly controlled, well, you're not getting good data. Same thing with IT cybersecurity. So you can see how all of these things tie together, pretty tightly there. Oh, to the next slide. So then we get to, okay, what is this new CPA evolution aligned exam? And so really it's to follow a new licensure model, if you will. And so we've identified the core, the accounting, auditing, and tax, which I mentioned earlier. So it's a strong focus there. That's the foundational stuff that everybody needs to know, all CPAs need to know. And then we've changed it up where candidates now can select a discipline of their choosing. So it could be the tax compliance and planning, business analysis and reporting, or information systems and controls. So historically, over the last little bit, there's been 4 sections of the exam. It's been auditing, financial accounting and reporting, BEC, business environment and concepts, and regulation. Business environment and concepts as a section has gone away. The material hasn't necessarily gone away. We've moved that around to some of the different sections here. But we've got our core sections, accounting, auditing, and tax, so that continues. We have aud, we have FAR, and we have reg. And then there are these 3 disciplines, which, as I said, the candidates have an opportunity to select a discipline of their choice. And we'll get to that in a couple of minutes. So it it I think helped us, apportion the material a little better. Let's focus on what's really core, what's critically important there. And then people could, where do they think they're going to fit into this whole model? So I think, that has been the plan for this. And, as I said earlier, we started the work on this probably back in 2018, 2019. The AICPA board and NASBA board both voted to move forward with it in 2020. And then we did a lot of research for the balance of 2020 and 21, put out an exposure draft and in 22, and a final report by the end of 22, beginning of 23, to demonstrate what this exam would actually look like. So a lot of research was done to support where we're headed with this at this point. I mentioned this a little bit. The core assesses knowledge and skills, universal, common to all newly licensed CPAs. So this is the real foundational stuff. Everybody needs to know that. So that's what the core is all about. And the discipline, has those specific areas, and the names are fairly descriptive. We'll get into in a little bit who might choose one section of the exam over the other. Okay, so what does the exam look like? Designed for the 1 to 2 year level, and this is consistent with historical practice. The exam has always been designed to assess at that level somebody with 1 to 2 years of experience, because that's kind of how we define newly licensed. When you look at the experience requirement, it varies by states from 1 to 2 years. So that's kind of about the space that we would expect people to know. What are people doing at that point in time? There's no new education or experience requirements. So, generally across the country, there's 150 credit hour requirement in total. That will vary a little bit state by state, in terms of the required credits, in terms of accounting credits, other business credits, liberal arts credits, as the case may be. So there will be some differences in specific state requirements. And the experience requirement, as I said, most states, I believe, are at 1 year at this point in time. There are still some states, I believe, have a 2-year requirement. Candidates will still need to pass 4 sections of the exam. We'll talk in a little bit about transition, what happens, because we stopped, December 15th, we ceased giving the old exam. January 10th is the new exam, and kind of what happens to if I had credits under the old exam moving forward. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a couple of minutes. Exam sections can be taken in any order. So if you wanted to, you could take a discipline section and then take a core section later. Don't think that makes a lot of common sense, but I could see if somebody was taking reg and wanted to pursue TCP, that they might go take reg, and their next exam might be TCP, the tax compliance and planning, to follow that. That might make a lot of sense for that particular candidate, but there's no required order that the exams need to be taken in. No separate time limits to pass the core and the discipline. You have 18 to 30 months from passing the first section. So the way it works, you pass one section and then a clock starts running on your credits. And that says 18/30 months there. Historically, that was 18 months across the country. NASBA put out an exposure draft on dealing with this in the spring. They had proposed a 24-month period. Based on that exposure draft, it was ultimately agreed that states would adopt 30 months. But once again, this is implemented on a state-by-state basis. And we'll get to some slides a little further along to talk about that. But I will tell you, New Jersey, the state of New Jersey, was one of the first states in the country to adopt and implement the 30-month rule, which I believe they did on May 18th, if my memory serves me correctly. But we'll get to that in a little bit down the road. a candidate can only take one discipline, okay? You can't say, oh, well, I got my TCP, but I also want to get business analysis and reporting. Once you pass a discipline, you're done. Now, if you took TCP, tax compliance and planning, and said, you know what, I'm not sure I want to take that again, you could take either the business analysis and reporting or the ITC, the Information Systems and Control exam. So, and then last but not least, the discipline passed will not differentiate the license granted. So your license isn't going to say CPA tax or CPA bar or anything like that. There'll be no distinction, because keep in mind, the disciplines themselves, by taking a discipline, we're not establishing you by any stretch as a specialist or as an expert in that area. Keep in mind, this is all entry level, designed for the 1 to 2 year level. And this was always something that bothered me some when I first came on board with the AICPA. We talk about that the exam assesses the minimum level of knowledge and skills that someone is required to know to protect the public interest at the time of licensure. And I kind of said to myself, when in my life had I ever done anything to a minimum level? You know, I can hear my dad on my shoulder saying, you know, he would have been screaming at me. So it just, that's not the way I've functioned over the years. On the other hand, you're dealing with an exam for licensure. So there needs to be a common bar to measure, and it's what's the minimum level, and that's not like a 3 foot or a 4 foot high jump. It's, you know, but it's also not a 7 or 8 foot high jump. You know, it's kind of like somewhere, what is that spot? What's the level of knowledge and skills? And that's all of the research that we do is focused on that. You know, again, what is the work that the newly licensed CPAs are doing? How are we doing, Susan? Any questions?
No questions yet, Rich. Oh,
Okay.
I'm sorry. One just came in. For
Okay.
clarity, if you don't pass a discipline and you take a different discipline and pass along with passing the core sections within 30 months, that's okay?
Yes. Yeah. So I mean, so long as you know from the start of your first credit until you pass the 4th section, whatever that 4th section may be, that works. Now, if it goes longer than 30 months, you know, assuming those credits are all 30-month credits, you would end up losing the first credit you took, and they would, you know, but you know, certainly we don't want that to happen. We want you to stay focused on your studies and get this behind you as quickly as you can so you can get on with your career. Okay. So, and I talked a little bit about this, you know, from an education perspective, you know, New Jersey, I think the requirements, 150, you know, to be licensed. You can sit with a bachelor's degree, and 120, you could actually sit and take the exam, but to get your license, you need the 150. And I believe the New Jersey rules require 24 accounting and auditing credits and 24
Yes.
business credits, and that's kind of the extent of the specifications. But as you go through the process of applying, you know, you'll have to submit transcripts for review. But you should, you know, as you're in the midst of your college career, you should be looking at what the course requirements are to make sure you'll be compliant at the point in time that you you know, complete the exam and are able to be licensed. So I would keep that in mind. I talked about the 1 year requirement. New Jersey, I believe it's, you know, 1 year working for a New Jersey licensed CPA. I believe it needs to be generally in the area of accounting or auditing. And that 1 year would be considered 1,750 hours, I believe.
Rich, just to clarify, the CPA does not have to be licensed in New Jersey. The CPA
Okay.
can be licensed in any state.
Okay, thank you. Now, New Jersey, some states have a separate, you know, certainly we assess assess ethics on the CPA exam. Certain states have their own ethics exam that they require candidates to take. Some before they're licensed, and some there is a requirement, within a certain period of time after your license, which I believe is the case with the state of New Jersey. The one thing, you get to the exam, the exam is uniform. So there's 55 jurisdictions, and you're kind of like, what's that? Well, there's 50 states, plus then there's District of Columbia, Guam, the Virgin Islands, I believe Puerto Rico, and the Mariana Islands, if I've got the 5 territories correct as well. But the exam's the same across all of those entities. That's the one constant throughout the entire process, because there is a Uniform Accountancy Act, there's a Uniform Accountancy Regulations, but each state adopts that and may implement it a little bit differently. So as you pursue this, it will be important to understand where you want to be licensed. Most of you, I think, would be licensed in, New Jersey. Some of you might be planning to work in New York, so you might be interested in getting your New York State license. So if that was the case, you would need to, keep an eye out and understand what the New York State requirements are. Okay. All right. Start talking a little bit more specifically about the exam. The CPA exam is defined by the CPA exam blueprints. And you'll see here that this is a copy of the cover of the blueprints for the exam that launched in January 10th of 24. And this is all of the work that, we did in this practice analysis went into building these blueprints. This is something you absolutely critically need to have. It's available on our website. If you Google AICPA, CPA exam blueprints, it probably will be the first hit that comes up, and you can click this. This defines what's on the exam. This is the roadmap for the entire exam for each one of the 6 sections. Up till now, it was 4 sections, but now effective in 24, we've got a 6-section blueprint. And it can seem very daunting when you see it first. It's probably an inch plus thick. If you print it out, it's north of 100 pages. But you're going to focus on this for each exam section one at a time as you're taking those specific exams. So critical document. If you're working with a review course provider, the review course providers spend a lot of time understanding what's in our blueprints. Some of them actually use our blueprints as part of their coursework. But they are on top of this as well. But if you're not taking a review course provider, this is probably the best place that you can go to understand what you would be assessed for in each section of the exam. And the way it's, I'll kind of get into the different pieces, but it includes the content organization and the weighting on each one of the exam sections, and I'll show you that in a minute. Skill allocation, I'll show you that, the representative tasks, as well as the reference material. So that'll kind of, towards the end of each section blueprint, it will show you, there's a section that identifies the reference materials, which we look to derive the content for the exam. So here's a picture, from one of the pages. This is from the odd section of the exam. And it's particularly area 3, performing further procedures and obtaining evidence. You'll see there that's 30 to 40% of the exam. I'll talk about that in a minute again. But then, over on the left, you'll see the content groups and topics. So that's the content. So this is using data and information, requesting, preparing, transforming data. You'll see these skill sets. Now, I will tell you, the remember and understand is typically going to be assessed. Typically, it will always be assessed through the use of multiple choice questions. Application skill set will be assessed mostly with multiple choice questions, although it could also be assessed with task-based simulations. The analysis and the evaluation level tasks are going to be solely assessed by task-based simulations. So and you know, when you look at this, it kind of gives you that. And then all the way over on the right side, you'll see a representative task. And this isn't, you know, these are the kinds of questions we might ask would fall under the umbrella of these tasks. So if you go down to reliability of data and information, you'll see there perform procedures. They've got some examples to validate the reliability, completeness, accuracy, authenticity, and accessibility to management bias of data and information obtained. You know, I highlight that one, you know, it's on this page, but you know, when we talk about data, it's, you know, so absolutely critical to make sure you're dealing with complete and accurate data. You know, I mentioned data early on in the presentation. You know, if you're not dealing with good data to begin with, you're not going to get good results and conclusions out of that. So understanding that is just absolutely critical. And, you know, one for the exam, but I'm just talking about in general, as you're doing your jobs, absolutely, absolutely critical. Data and technology again. So these are the kind of, you know, one of the other things CPA evolution was about, quite honestly, as we went through this, was, you know, technology is moving faster and faster. And, you know, I will tell you, you know, right now, we're not assessing artificial intelligence on the exam, and we're not using artificial intelligence to create the exam. You may have seen some articles, you know, a while back, probably 8 months ago, 9 months ago at this point in time, where it was saying that ChatGPT passed the CPA exam. I can assure you, ChatGPT did not take the CPA exam and did not pass. First they said it failed, then they said it passed, but it did not take the exam, I can assure you. So, you know, artificial intelligence is a technology that at some point in time will certainly impact the accounting profession, and it's impacting it already. We're not there yet for the exam. You know, a couple years down the road, we may be. You know, what's the impact of artificial technology? What audit procedures might you have to undertake as a result of one of your clients using artificial intelligence, and how would you deal with that? So, I mean, that will come into play. But my point is, technology impacts what we do as accountants, and that's a good thing in many ways. You know, a lot of the menial tasks that I used to do, we used to call it grunt work. Well, newly licensed CPAs aren't doing that work anymore, because in fact, those tasks have been automated at this point in time. But what does that also mean? It means it's changing what newly licensed CPAs are doing. So, you know, we need to understand that. So you'll see some of the things here, you know, that we would assess: determining methods to transform the data to make it useful for decision making, verifying completeness and accuracy of source data. Again, I keep going back to that. And then using the outputs from automated tools, visualizations, data analytics to assist in risk assessment, prepare financial statements, tax returns, identify patterns, trends, anomalies. You know, we're going to use data in many different ways in an audit going forward, and we're going to assess that. Now, on the exam, you're not going to specifically use the automated tools. You're going to use outputs from what automated tools would be. So that would be the nature of the questions. We're not able to build an automated tool to do some type of an analytic technique as part of the exam itself. But we will test you on this type of information by looking at what the outputs would be. All right, so moving along, you know, kind of the totally new content areas in the exam. Where are they? They're going to be in ISC, the Information Systems and Control section, and TCP, Tax Compliance and Panning. So in ISC, you'll see here IT infrastructure, platform services, security, including cybersecurity, confidentiality, and privacy, and considerations for service organization control engagements. That's dealing with the trust services criteria that have been established by the AICPA. That information is all going to be covered off in the ISC section. We'll get into that a little more detail down in some further slides. But, you know, this is kind of one of the newest areas. But why is it on the exam? We heard from the profession there's a critical need. They need people in this space. And then also, you know, we're expanding the tax section of the exam somewhat with tax compliance and planning, getting into a little bit of personal financial planning and tax planning. You know, we had some tax planning in the exam, but it's much more, you know, now skewed a little bit more into the personal financial planning side, but kind of derived out of doing income tax work, if you will. Okay. So talk a little bit about each one of the discipline sections and who might be interested in taking these sections as we move forward. So business analysis and reporting. This is, you know, somebody who, you know, could be a financial statement auditor, somebody who might want to go into business and industry, who'd be doing financial business analysis, could be somebody on the finance side, some analytics, some more expansive technical accounting and reporting. And, you know, so and you'll see here some of the type of information, you know, in terms of, once again, analyzing financial statement data, you know, the use of the data, once again, that keeps coming back. There's going to be some of the more technical, advanced accounting would be assessed in this section. You know, and you'll see here, it says higher order skills related to RevRec and lease accounting. You know, we assess the basics on revenue recognition, and lease accounting are going to be assessed in FAR, but at a higher skill level, we'll assess that in the BAR section of the exam. And the other thing that's ended up in BAR that had been in FAR up till now is state and local government accounting. So that was almost just kind of a lift from what we had in the FAR section of the exam, moving that over to BAR. So somebody, you know, you could be a financial statement auditor, you could be working for a firm, and it would make a lot of sense for you to get the BAR section of the exam, you know, and if this is where your interest is. Moving along, information systems and controls, and I kind of alluded to this earlier. This is a huge growth area. One of the biggest growth areas in the CPA firms right now are issuing service organization control reports on the controls and particularly, you know, certainly SOC 1, which deals with internal controls over financial reporting, and SOC 2, which would be the trust service criteria. So, you know, a little bit different focus of each one of those reports, but clearly a very high growth area. I mean, when I started with the firm, you know, we probably might get one SOC report, and they weren't called SOC reports back then. There were SAS 70 reports, but we've got a SOC report, and it's more often than not was going to be on a company's payroll provider. You know, for example, if a company outsources their payroll to ADP, we would get a SAS 70 report or SOC report on the controls at the service organization at ADP that our client would be relying on in terms of their internal controls over financial reporting, because that payroll is rolling up into their financial systems. So you know, here in particular, you'll see IT audit and advisory services, SOC engagements, data management, again, getting down into a little lower level with data, a little bit more focus on that. So that would be the type information. And when you want to, you know, understand the more detail, you go to the blueprint, and it lays out section by section what we would be covering off in information systems and controls. And then last but not least, tax compliance and planning. So this is somebody who's probably wants to do taxes for a living, quite honestly, would want to take tax compliance and planning. And as I said earlier, we've extended this a little bit. It's going beyond, you know, basic taxes and into a little bit of personal financial planning at this point in time. It does assess, at a little, dealing with the more complex areas and taxes for both individual and entities, the more routine, less complex transactions would be assessed in the reg section. I'll talk a little bit more when we get to the detailed blueprints for that. Any questions, Susan?
Nothing right now, Rich.
Okay. So we'll move along. And I'll tell you, I love having the opportunity to do this, and it's good that we can do it, online. We're able to touch a lot of people, but I really do miss it in your eyeballs because I don't know whether you're getting what I'm saying. When I'm in front of a room, I can really get that sense. So if you have any questions, please do submit them in and Susan will pass them along to us, okay? So I talked earlier about the blueprint. This is a page from the blueprint. And it would be the summary page. And you'll see here, the OD section has 4 different content areas: ethics, professional responsibilities, assessing risk, developing planned response, performing further procedures, and forming conclusions and reporting. If you kind of think about that, that's kind of the flow of an engagement, if you will, because you got to go through, can you accept the engagement in the first place? Are you independent? Whatever you need to do. Then you have your planning phase, assessing risk, developing a response. Then you've got your substantive procedures in area 3, and ultimately you form your conclusions and issue a report. So that kind of follows the normal flow of an audit. And you'll see here the weightings in terms of the content, 15 to 25, 25 to 35, blah, blah, blah. Every time we put together an audit exam, we need to make sure that those weighting bands are met. So you're always going to get 15 to 25% of the questions you get on that section of the exam, or on the audit section, would be on ethics, professional responsibilities. Assessing risk is going to be 25 to 35. So, I mean, we put those parameters together, and those are hard parameters. And as we assemble the exam, we make sure that we're meeting those requirements. Similarly, in terms of the skill levels, and the skill levels, if you remember, if you go back to the slide I had a little while ago, we talked about the different skill levels, and the skill level is really driven by the representative tasks, is what drives the skill level. But that's the allocation of the skill levels across the exam. And OD has evaluation. It's the only section of the exam that has evaluation questions on it, skill level questions. And I think that kind of makes sense. I mean, auditing is kind of what the profession historically has been all about. So it makes sense. And, and most people, that is their entry point into the firms, into the CPA world, profession, if you will. So I think it makes a lot of sense that this is the section that has evaluation in it. Evaluation analysis, as I mentioned earlier, are going to be covered off with task-based simulations, application, multiple choice questions, and task-based simulations, and remember and understanding all MCQs, right? Okay, so moving on to the FAR section. You'll see this now has 3 sections, or 3 content areas. You'll see the weighting there and the skill allocation. As I mentioned, you do not see an evaluation level. It's only the other 3 levels that are included here. This used to have 4 sections, which included the state and local government. But as I mentioned earlier, that has moved on over to the bar section of the exam. This would include, some of the more basic accounts, cash, trade receivables, inventory, property, plant, and equipment, subsequent events would kind of be assessed at the higher skill levels. That would be at the analysis level. But then some of the more complex material, for example, the revenue recognition and the leases, are going to be down at the RNU and the application level, just to give you a sense there, okay?
And Rich, there's one question regarding the FAR exam here. What are the
Yes.
main changes in the FAR exam? And then the second question was, why is it going to take so long to get scores back, especially for if the core exams, if there were not major changes to them?
Okay, and I'll get to that, the second question a little bit later in the presentation.
Okay.
As I said, the biggest change in FAR was moving state and local government into the bar section of the exam. I think the FAR section, once again, has gotten, more focused on what is really core. So the financial reporting, again, it's going to be, core financial reporting. The balance sheet accounts are going to be covered off there. This covers public and non-public companies. It covers not-for-profit. So all of that is still covered here. And probably the split, I mean, we have moved over, some of the more complex stuff has moved over to bar. And maybe I'll get to the bar and you'll hear about some of the stuff that moved over from FAR when we get to bar, okay? So going through the reg section of the exam, as I look at this, you'll see 5 areas. These are kind of the 5 areas that it has historically had. We did increase the allocation to business law a little bit. It had been from 10 to 20%, and it's gone up to 15 to 25%. But I will tell you, that's a fraction of this exam. Back a million years when I took the exam, business law was its own section. So I mean, that was a 4-hour exam back in the day. Here, I would say what continues to be covered here would be the more basic kind of stuff. So if you're thinking about dealing with the property transactions, it's probably the basis of assets, as well as cost recovery methods will be covered here. Whereas over in TCP, we'd be covering off the computation of gains and losses. So, here it's probably more based on, what is recurring kind of transactions, the more basic kind of stuff that every accountant would see is going to get covered off in reg. Where you're going to see covered off in TCP is probably more somebody who's over in the tax department, what they would probably see. But again, the best way to look at this kind of stuff is to flip the blueprints that I mentioned earlier. Okay. Moving over to bar. So over in bar, going back to the question from FAR, we have moved over here some of the accounting concepts that were previously assessed in FAR. So things like indefinite lived intangible assets, internally developed software, stock compensation, R&D, business combinations, derivatives, hedge accounting, that's all over here. All right, so that would give you some sense of what we've moved out of FAR and into bar. Although, as I say, I qualify all of this by go back and look at the detailed blueprints, because it'll tell you exactly what we're assessing in one place versus the other. In addition, taking a look at leases, from the and revenue from a little bit more of the analysis perspective here. So here you'd probably get a customer contract or a lease agreement and need to look at that to determine what would be the appropriate accounting. Whereas in FAR, we would have just tasted on a more basic, how do you account for this? It'd be a much more basic, as opposed to actually having to go through an analysis level sense with that. The other thing, covered off, we are covering off some public company accounting requirements are covered off here. They were probably previously in FAR as well. Okay. Moving along, ISC. So this is information systems and data management, the security, confidentiality, and privacy, and considerations for a system and organization or it should be service organization. I apologize. It's an error in my slides there. Service organization control engagements. You'll see this section of the exam has the highest percentage of any of the sections in multiple choice questions in terms of remember and understanding. And that's particularly when you get into, you know, the security, confidentiality, and privacy area. You know, we are testing, you know, some fairly specific material there. And once again, when you look at the blueprint, we've given you pretty good direction there as to what you need to know so you've got the right amount of focus on that, because this could be, you know, all over the place, you know, but, you know, things like GDPR, HIPAA, the like, you know, what are the different security frameworks that you might be assessed on? So that is all covered off there. And as I said, the system and organization control service organization control engagements, pardon me. This is kind of how do you do it? This would be the planning and the reporting on it. You'd be covered off in area one here in area two, some of the aspects that you would cover in doing the procedures, the planning, and what you would actually be testing. But for example, so this could cover SOC 1 or SOC 2, or SOC 3 for that matter, reports here. But in terms of SOC 1 reports, you go all the way back to the odd section of the exam. And to the extent that a SOC 1 report relates to financial statements, and the SOC 1 report is internal controls over financial reporting, you know, that needs to be covered off in the odd section and continues to be covered off in the odd section. This is more on how you perform the SOC engagement itself. Okay, and last but not least, the TCP section. As I said, this is going to be some of your more non-routine and higher complex transactions in terms of what would get covered off here. It covers off the tax planning for individuals and the personal financial planning. So this is, you know, new, but, you know, one of the things to think of, and I think when you look at reg and TCP, there's kind of a continuum there. And you look at the two blueprints and you kind of see a flow from one section to the other. And you see FAR and BAR, and I think it's very similar where you kind of see a flow from the FAR section over to the BAR section. Aud and ISC, it's kind of a little bit different. I mean, ISC, it's still about risk assessment. It's still about attestation work. So it's related to Aud, but Aud is focused on financial statements, if you will, where ISC is going to be focused on information technology systems and controls themselves. So I think, you know, that's kind of the split. So I kind of view the FAR BAR and the Reg TCP as brother sister exams. And when I think about Aud and ISC, I'm kind of like, well, they're either cousins or maybe second cousins, as opposed to the brother sister. Definitely related, just not as a direct kind of correlation from one to the other.
So Rich, there was a question about Aud. What are the main changes to the Aud exam in 24?
The changes in Aud, you know, there's not a lot over there. We moved out of Aud the planning related to a SOC engagement and the reporting on a SOC engagement. That's moved over to TCP. On that, we picked up a little bit of material from BEC into Aud. So, I mean, Aud is probably the section that has the least amount of change of the sections, although we still are, in as much as we're looking to assess, you know, how technology is used, those changes are reflected across all of the core sections as well. So, but there has been less taken away from Aud, if you will, than the other sections. Mostly additive, but just a little bit of additive, quite honestly. Okay, moving along. Each one of the exams is still 4 hours long. They're 4 hours today. They're 4 hours going forward. You'll see here the mix of multiple choice questions. As I mentioned, the highest level of remember and understand is in the ISC discipline. So you'll see the MCQs are higher there and the task-based simulations are lower. So that's just kind of, a high level sense. And all of this, by the way, is covered in the blueprints as well. And then the exam design in terms of how the score is weighted, you'll see all of the exams other than ISC are 50-50 between the multiple choice questions and the task-based simulations, and ISC is 60-40. Okay. All right. One other thing I want to talk about on changes to the exam, and this may be more for people who have been taking the exam in the past to who are going forward with it right now. We have made some relatively significant changes in a couple of areas. Research, we've historically, we used to have something called the authoritative literature was part of the exam. When you launched your exam, you would be able to access a library of the FASBs, the SASs, the audit codification, the Internal Revenue Code. You would be able to access that. We've removed that from the exam. At the time, we had specific questions where we gave you a little bit of a setup for the question, and you had to search to find where in the literature that question would be addressed. And quasi, it got to the point that it wasn't really research, it was more search. It was kind of keyword search and could you find it. So while when we initially included it, we thought it was appropriate, we thought it needed to go further than that. So now we're still assessing research, we're doing it in task-based simulations, but we're going to provide you as part of a task-based simulation a setup, leading into the question. Then we'll give you as an exhibit a portion of the authoritative literature. You need to look at the facts, look at the question, and then look at the literature and figure out how to analyze the facts and apply that literature to those facts to get to a conclusion. So a little bit different approach, but that was a structural change because we took the authoritative literature off the exam. A number of years ago, I think it was probably back in 2018, we added Excel as a spreadsheet to the exam. We didn't have a spreadsheet on the exam prior to that. At the time, we were hoping we were going to be able to do more with Excel. I talked earlier about being able to manipulate data, that we don't assess that on the exam. We'll kind of use outputs right now. There's a number of technical problems with that. Plus, the other issue was from a security perspective, and security is very important to the exam, we had to stay focused on, some features of Excel had to be turned off because people could potentially get out to the internet from a Prometric test center or get underneath the exam, which would have been obviously a real problem from a security perspective. So we weren't using Excel to the extent we could, and people were telling us when they got into the exam, they didn't even recognize Excel because what they were commonly able to do in Excel, they weren't able to do in the Excel version on the exam. So we took Excel out of the exam. We put a new spreadsheet in the exam. It's Java-based, which kind of means it can integrate into the exam software better. And in fact, this spreadsheet is available to you on our exam sample test. So you're able to use the spreadsheet that you'll see in the exam. You'll be able to use it as part of the sample test to get familiar with it. It's very similar to Excel. We've done a fair amount of testing on it, and we've gotten good feedback from candidates already on it. So I think this was a good move going forward. With BEC going away, we've taken the written communication tasks off the exam. And it's not to say writing is not important to the profession. It's critically important to the profession. when you document something, you need to be able to write. Again, the problem here was we were only able to assess writing from a perspective is it well-formed and well-written? But we weren't able to assess the technical accuracy, and that bothered us. So, based on talking with our various constituents, it was agreed to take the written communication off the exam. We'll continue to research this, and as time goes on, if we are able to better assess the technical accuracy, it may come back. The last one, multi-stage adaptive testing. Historically, when you took the exam, how you did and you have to give you a little bit of there's different testlets to the exam. So right now the exam is made up of 5 testlets, 2 multiple choice, and then 3 task-based simulations. When you take your first multiple choice testlet in the old exam, the exam software would say, how did this person perform here? If they perform well, it would take you to a more difficult multiple choice section. If you didn't perform as well, it would take you to an easier multiple choice section. It was able to help us on scoring originally and dealing with, once again, some security concerns we had initially when the exam was launched as a computerized exam back in 2004, which, by the way, tells you that we're now at our 20th anniversary of a computerized exam. We don't need it any longer. So we're able to get a good assessment without that. So we've eliminated that to simplify the exam. Now, moving along. Questions, Susan, or we're good?
We're good right now.
Okay. All right. Looks like we have just about 20 minutes left if I'm looking at my clock right here.
Yeah. 1:15.
Okay. So, moving along. So we talked earlier, we shut down the old exam on December 15th. And so you can't continue with the old exam. So what happens to your credits? All right. If you passed Aud, FAR, or Reg, you would not have to take the core Aud, the core FAR, or the core Reg. On the other hand, if you hadn't passed any one of those, you would have to take the core Aud, FAR, or Reg. BEC covered off the disciplines. So if you passed BEC before December 15th, when the exam shut down, you would not have to take the business analysis and reporting, information system control, or tax compliance and planning. If you hadn't passed BEC, well, you need to make your choice which one you want to take. And you'll see here, this says 18-month rule remains in effect. That's now the 18-30-month rule, if you will, because not all states have yet adopted the 30 months. If you lose your Aud credits because they timed out because of an 18 or 30 month, then you would need to sit for the new core. If you lost your BEC credits because they timed out, you would have to sit for one of the disciplines. All right. Now, score holds. This is a question that was raised a few minutes ago, and you'll see here the testing dates we have. January 10th, the core testing dates, January 10th, March 26th, April 1, blah, 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 download. A couple columns over the discipline testing dates, and then when the score report dates come out. So that's a long time. I mean, typically, when we give the exam, we have testing begins generally on the 1st of every quarter, and we start issuing scores probably 30 days after the first exam is issued, and then 20 days, each subsequent 20-day period, the scores come out. Why can that happen now? Well, when we come up with a new exam, we have to go through, and I'll jump to the next slide, and I can come back to this in a minute so we have more time to look at it. But when we come out with a new exam, we have to do analysis to understand those scores and what that means. So we're going to have score holds, and we do this every time there's a major change to the exam. So it was back in 11 and 17 was the last time we did this. There is, you heard me going through, there is a fair amount of new content. I know, the point would be that, yeah, well, there's not as much in audit, and I acknowledge that. But there are, in addition to that, there's the infrastructure changes that could impact how somebody performs on the exam. So because of that, we have the score holds. And what happens? It says additional analysis is needed. All right. Just so you appreciate the nature and the extent of what we do here. We have to effectively what we call reset the cut score. So what is the score that people need to achieve to indicate what's the, I kind of mentioned that minimum bar, that's the cut. And to do that, you say, well, the passing score is 75 all the time, so what's the deal? That passing score is kind of, level to a passing score that's established by the AICPA. But how do we do that? We bring in practitioners who actually take the exam, and they tell us what they think from their perspective newly licensed CPAs should know, and whether they should be getting questions right or questions wrong. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect is we have to see how candidates actually perform. So we look at all of the performance on the exam, and we have these really smart guys called psychometricians who are PhDs in psychology with a heavy statistics background, who, the concept of psychometrics is the measurement of learning. So they're able to go through and they, analyze, synthesize, pasteurize all of this information, and, work with our board of examiners to set that cut score, which is then scaled to the 75. So that 75 doesn't change, but so when you get 75, it doesn't mean you got 75% of the questions right or wrong. It's that the scaled score for the cut is equated to that 75. So that's why we have to go through this process. I know it's frustrating to everybody because they want to be able to move on, but there's just no way around it. Looking back at these dates, the score hold periods get much shorter after the first quarter. They're probably almost cut in half compared to what they were. And it's, if you take if you took your exam on March 10th, or pardon me, January 10th, I know it seems inconceivable that you're not getting a score until June 4th, but we have to get all of the candidates complete. So we have to get, anybody who took their exam on March 26th, they have to be part of all of this analysis work as well. And you'll see June 4th there, April 24th for the disciplines. But I will tell you, if you receive your score on June 4th, you would still have 3 weeks till the next testing window closes. Or if you have received your score on April 24th, you have till May 19th on the discipline side. So, there is a period of time there, and those are like, I don't know, 3 to 4 weeks there. They go up to, when you go out into the outer quarters, almost 2 months time before the next testing window closes. I know it's frustrating. I wish I had a better solution, but we don't. And that just, this isn't just the CPA exam. This is when any, what we call major high stakes testing exam, licensure exam, there's been significant revision. This is the type of process we have to go through. With that, all right, and kind of covered off that as well. So here's an important point, and part of this was done, quite honestly, with because of the concept of the score holds. Any candidate who has an outstanding credit on January 1st to 24, however short those credits might only have a 1 month life on them. Everybody's, for all of their existing credits on January 1 to 24, those credits are being extended to the end of June of 25. So effectively, you got an 18-month refresh date on all of those credits. And if you look at this next slide, that has been adopted universally across the country. You'll see here, I think Oklahoma, it's approved, but they're just needing to make some of their formal rule changes to make that happen. But
Hey,
that has
Rich.
been, yes.
Sorry, do you know when NASBA is going to reflect that in each one of the dashboards that the students see? Because I know that some of them are saying that they're not seeing that extension.
That I do not know. I can reach out to Pat Hartman at NASBA and try and get an answer to that question.
Thanks.
Yep. All right, so there's that. So then there's this other rule that NASBA put out, I talked about it earlier, an exposure draft, where the exposure draft had recommended going out 24 months as opposed to the 18. The states came back generally and said, we want to do 30 months. And so most states are in the process of going through that right now. As I mentioned earlier, New Jersey, you see here in green, was one of the very first states to have adopted and implemented that. And as I say, I believe the state board voted on that on May 18th. So I believe that is prospective from May 18th for credits received after that date, that those credits would have a 30-month life. You'll see here, most of the states have voted to go to 30 months. That's already happened. Washington State, if you're lucky enough to be living up in Washington, they voted to go to a 36-month period. That's that one. Or no, they've already implemented 36, pardon me, and Minnesota has adopted it, but it's not implemented, I believe, right? Yep. All right. So less than a week from now, there is another, there's going to be a joint AICPA NASBA webcast put together. It will cover some of the same information that's been covered off here, although it will, include some NASBA representatives directly on there. I mentioned Pat Hartman's name. She's a really helpful person at NASBA, dealing with a lot of exam questions. So she will be on that along with one of my associates, a guy by the name of Joe Maslot, who works with me on the exam, and the two of them will be doing that. So if you could go to the NASBA website and find a link to that, or if you scan this QR code, I think you can probably do that off your computer screen. You'll get that. And I also talk to Susan. I will be getting my slides over to her later today, and she'll distribute them all to you so you have information on this. Okay. We do have a couple of websites as well, and so you'll get the slides. You'll be able to go to these different websites on the exam. This takes you to a toolkit we have. This Way to CPA. This is a great source for both students and academics. There's an academic page here as well as a student page. On the student page, one of the things I'd recommend to you, you can sign up for a free membership, and I'll kind of double underscore free membership to the AICPA as a student member. I highly recommend you do that. That will, keep you well informed on what's going on with the exam, as well as what's going on in the profession. I think it's really a good thing for you to start getting tied into the profession sooner than later. And then I think this is probably my final slide, is a new booklet we've put together, talking about a career and the exam. So that would be available to you as well.